Wonderful. And thank you so much, Benji. If anybody doesn't want to be recorded, make sure you just turn off your camera and you won't be. But otherwise, as Benji said, we are recording. So this can be living in YouTube forever. Welcome everybody to Oktoberfest. I am so excited to have you all here with our nice fireside tasting. This is one of our first public tastings that's taking place in my living room. So welcome everybody to my home, and I'm so happy you guys are here for this tasting. Even as I was kind of thinking through this menu and looking at it all spread out, it's a somewhat more like, it's not the most formal tasting. It's a really fun kind of snack food, delicious product. It's not as stuffy, I think, in some ways. And we also have some great treats with the meat and the pretzels and everything. So it's a really fun lineup of product. And we're going to go all around the world, and we're going to focus on like Bavaria, right, in a really wide kind of definition of that, or Bavaria-inspired foods. And we're going to talk a little bit about Oktoberfest. And kind of, as always, what my hopes is tonight is we're going to walk through and introduce every product on its own. But really quickly, once we kind of introduce the cast of characters, we're going to start mashing things up, trying combinations of flavors, and learning how we do pairings at Mongers and how we approach these ideas. I know that a lot of you have been on our tastings before, and we tend to always talk about wine. I'm really excited to talk about beer, and I think you guys will see beer is often, it's just a little bit more, how should I say? It's softer. It's easier to pair in some ways. I see we have our first poll. Benji's going to be working on some polls tonight, so please answer along. It's just another way for us to have fun. And yeah. In terms of introducing everybody who's on the call today, we have Benji, the monger behind the Mongers, on the ones and twos. So there's also Chelsea, who's going to be making sure the chat doesn't go neglected. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and chat. Go ahead and get our attention. Unmute yourself. It's not the biggest group in the world, so it's going to be a nice conversation, I hope. And you guys know it's always way more interesting when you guys participate and give us questions. So Oktoberfest. I know before we started, I was asking people who's been, and I was surprised when I was learning about this. Oktoberfest is one of the festivals that's the most common, but there's a general idea of Volksfest, right? These people's festivals, and they happen throughout the Bavarian world, and they're generally a free beer, and all the rides and things that kind of come along, that's where you pay. And so whether it's the municipality, the kind of village you're in, or if it's a local brewery who wants to sponsor, they're literally just free beer tents for free food and drink and merriment. And then kind of a whole, I guess, festival builds up around that. And that's where the money ends up getting made, is in the rides and the games and the this and the that. But I love this idea of a free beer festival, right? And I love the idea that it comes around this time, right? Many cultures around this time have a harvest idea, right? Whether or not we're pressing grapes or getting our field ready for winter and finishing up with our summer crops, there's this kind of feeling of anticipation this time of year, of weather changing. We were just talking about the light change from when we first started doing these series of tastings. It's a really fun and exciting time of year. It deserves a festival. In terms of autumnal flavors, it's always been one of my favorite times of year as a chef or as a food curator. I like to say in summer, you don't need to have the most creativity or talent, right? Summer has such bold, delicious flavors that it does most of the work for you. In autumn, it starts taking a little more thought and a little more teasing of these flavors, right? Even the fruits and the vegetables, we start going from fresh stuff off the vine to storage vegetables that really do need cooking. And I just think it's a time of year where we get to unlock a lot of cool things. So let's talk real quick about our beers, introduce those as kind of our three things that we're going to go in and out of as we talk flavors. And then we'll start talking, we'll go beer, meat, and then cheese. And then, of course, once we introduce everything, you guys can start mashing it all up and making some fun sandwiches and combinations. So the beer we have, I think the most common and famous Oktoberfest beer, right? We often see it just called Oktoberfest, especially with American breweries. It's usually a Marzen. And a Marzen's a really nice kind of common style of ale. And, in the nature of Mongers provisions, we're always doing things kind of a little last minute. And Marzen like many of these different seasonal beers, you have to order way in advance to get any Marzen. And so when we started to think about doing an Oktoberfest, we actually were really enjoying the challenge of finding beers that would work for it, even though they weren't Marzens. And there's been such a cool explosion of interest in these really cool regional and small beers, right? I really have loved the craft brew scene for the last 20 years or so, but I think it's been fun to see it go from punch you in the face IPAs to everybody celebrating Pilsners and Kolsches and lawnmower beers. These lighter beers, these beers that are about balance, they're A, most often more food friendly, and B, I think you can just kind of, they have a time and a place just like anything else. So I've really enjoyed how many different breweries are making a Kolsch right now. We also love Eastern Market Brewery. We've been enjoying working with them in many different capacities and love seeing all of their growth lately with Ferndale Project and things. And so this is their Kolsch. Kolsch is a type of beer from Cologne, Germany. And it's a lighter ABV. You can see it in the color. It's not a lot of toast in our malt. It's a really light, easy drinking beer. It's a good lunch beer. And in Cologne, you can actually, when you order a Kolsch, you'll often get it in a smaller glass. It is really a beer that you would have with a little lunch. Our second beer, I'm switching up the order just for anybody who's looking at your menu. I have the Freigeist, the Dortmunder. Freigeist is a really cool brewery. You know, the other two we have are Michigan, but these guys are actually a German brewery. And so often when we're talking about European breweries, we're like, well, these guys started in 1600, and these guys were an abbey that was making beer for the last century. These guys started in 2009. So it's kind of a cool story. And in my mind, they've really been inspired by all this excitement internationally about beer. And so when they came on the scene, they're really trying to resurrect things like Kolsch, these regional esoteric German beers. So Dortmunder, I had never heard of before. It's kind of like a Helles, a little hoppier, similar to a Pilsner. And you can see we're just getting a little more color on those malts. And then we're going to go all the way to the end with the Old Nation Vienna. So Vienna style lager is a really, classic idea. And in this case, we're going to get a little bit more toast in those crystal malts. A little side story, when Will and I were seniors in high school, our first beer we ever brewed was from a Mr. Beer kit. And I don't know if anybody remembers those, but they didn't have alcohol in the kit, just the promise of future alcohol. So they sold it to us because we were under 21. And then we brewed it in my closet in high school. And it was a Vienna Lager. And I can assure you that this one is infinitely better than the terrible one Will and I made. As soon as they said you can add more sugar to get more alcohol, we threw the recipe out and just kept adding sugar. So today we're all going to enjoy this one a lot more, and no terrible hangovers either, hopefully. So we have a Vienna Lager. And then the meats we have today, we don't usually do meat at our tastings, and I'm excited, and it seems fitting, right? How could you do Oktoberfest? How could you do anything from Europe without a little bit of pork? So we have two really fun meats. The first one's coming out of Chicago. I see my chocolate bars hiding my salami. We have the Nostrano, and the Nostrano is coming from Tempesta. We love Tempesta. If anybody's had the Wagyu pastrami this year, that's also from Tempesta. They've become one of our favorite companies. They're out of Chicago. It's Tony and his dad, and they're just a really fun, couple. They're always kind of kibitzing and, arguing in a half Italian, half English to each other. His father grew up in Calabria, and so they've always been informed by the Calabrian traditions and big spicy salamis. And they started as Nduja artisans, if anybody knows that name. And as the world started having more Nduja brands, they decided to change their name. And if you're in the Chicago area, they have a great little deli. You can go get sandwiches at their spot. So that's our salami. Our meat, our whole muscle, the sliced thin meat, is the Speck. And Speck's kind of perfect for this whole tasting because Speck will tie many of our regions that we're talking about together, right? We live in the Rust Belt, right? From Buffalo, New York to Indianapolis, Detroit, we're all in this kind of Rust Belt. And I like to joke that Bavaria and the Alps is kind of the Speck Belt, right? Because whether or not you're in Alto Adige in Italy, or if you're in Bavaria in Germany, or many other places in between, everybody loves Speck, right? Prosciutto is a thing that you'll see, but it's always going to be coming from outside in. Speck is what they're going to be making in the area. And there's going to be some variations that you can find, like Black Forest ham and things like this that are even more smoky. But this idea of taking the prosciutto leg or a pig leg and pressing it and seasoning it with bay season or bay leaf, juniper, black pepper, and then smoking it slightly, it is really common throughout this mountainous region. And it really unites everyone from Switzerland through Italy, through Germany, and so on and so forth. So we have some wonderful Speck, and I think it's going to play out some of those flavors tonight. Does anybody have questions before we start diving into cheese? I know that was a lot very quickly.
No questions so far.
Okay. And the only reason I'm going fast through the beginning is because we have, what do we have, 9 products, right? It's different than when we usually only have like 4 or 6. I want us to really introduce everything because there's so many flavors. And unlike the wine where it's often like, don't try the goat with the red, but try this and this, I think you're going to find that everything works and everything kind of has its own effect on the product. So I want to really spend a lot of time on this compare and contrast later on. So I apologize if I'm going fast. Let's jump into cheese. Pimento cheese. I love pimento cheese. I probably have a pimento cheese problem. I always joked when we started carrying this, it was just to feed my own wholesale, to get wholesale pricing on my own addiction. Pimento cheese is a southern food spread, right? And it's really common throughout the United States in the South. And it's not that, say, it's definitely not haute cuisine. It's not this elevated idea, but leave it to Zingerman's to kind of take a southern tradition and spruce it up a little bit, right? Ari has these moments where he gets really inspired by something, and the Southern Foodways Alliance has been a major source of inspiration for him for a while, and that's where the pimento cheese came from. And it became kind of a cult thing within Zingerman's. Zingerman's, every single business kind of had their own recipe, little tweak here, a little tweak there. It really started in the early 2000s with the Roadhouse. And that, when I started in 2008 or so, I just kind of became obsessed. So pimento cheese is cheddar, piquillo peppers, a little mayo, a little salt and pepper. It's something you can totally make a version at home, but I think they just do it so darn well that I love it. And it goes so well with these different autumnal flavors. So, we also have a new vehicle for you tonight with the Pop Daddy Pretzels. Pop Daddy is a company out of Michigan, and he makes bold flavor everything. I tried to look for plain, and it just doesn't exist. Everything's flavored. They're kind of a bold company, but I think you'll enjoy it with the pimento cheese. Pretzels and pimento cheese is, probably like a 3-day-a-week kind of snack for me. As we say this, I'm going to take a little food break here.
Zach, are there different variations of pimento cheeses and different recipes for people to make?
Totally. And the variations aren't set. Like, it's not like the way barbecue is so regionalized and set. But if you try a dozen different pimento cheeses, you'll see different things. So many of our kind of friends over here would have probably tried something from Sweetgrass Dairy along the way. They make the Green Hill Camembert, Thomasville Tome. We really like them out of Georgia. They started making a pimento cheese where you have chunks of bell pepper and maybe even carrot and onion. So it has this major vegetal kick compared to this. You'll also see it where it's even looser and more mayo-like, and it's really just a spread. It's one of the most, it's one of like the 3 common sandwiches you can get at the Kentucky Derby. I believe with all those people, there's not like a huge menu at all the food spots. And so pimento sandwiches is one of the traditional sandwiches. And that's going to be a much more mayo-y one, I believe. Great question, Benji. All right. So I know I said everything is Bavarian inspired. And outside of Zingerman's pimento cheese, the other one where we really have to use our imagination is going to be Red Dragon. It's in the UK, but the flavors just go so well with all of this stuff. I thought it was a great suggestion by Will. Red Dragon is one of our OG cheeses. If you have known us since our very beginning at pop-ups, at Gale's Chocolates in whatever year that was, 2016, 17, we had Red Dragon. And in fact, when Benji and I were still living together and I was really just doing this as a pop-up business, this was definitely my lunch for like a full week. Red Dragon and Cars crackers. I had a lot of cheese and not a lot of money at some point. Still probably the case. But I just love the texture on this cheese. It's something that I find you can snack on quite a bit. It is a mustard studded cheddar style cheese, it's really kind of they wouldn't call it cheddar in Somerset, but it's almost more like a Caerphilly or a Cheshire. It has this really soft, crumblier texture, which I really adore. And then it has a little horseradish and ale in there too. So it's a cheese that really, as you chew, you get a lot of different flavors. I love how the mustard seed pops on your palate. And it's also fun to melt with, right? I often find when you're making a mac and cheese, you put a little dried mustard powder in it anyways. And so in this case, you're kind of bringing the mustard that way. And if you're making it with a sandwich, you can skip a step and skip the mustard, put a little ham and cheese together, and it's just delightful. That piece had a nice
that just came in from Terry. How do you find these products? Obviously, these things are sourced from around the world. What's your method, and how have you gotten to this?
Yeah, so the way I find the most product is probably going to conferences. It's a hard year this year because everything was canceled. Oktoberfest was canceled in Munich, and so was the American Cheese Society Conference, which is probably my favorite thing to do. And that goes in a different place every year. And the other big thing are the fancy food shows. They happen every year on both coasts. So in San Francisco, you have the fancy food show every winter, and then the summer fancy food shows in New York in August, which is always a rough time to be in New York. And that's a really fun, and it's an international expo, right? Especially the New York one has an even bigger international side than the San Francisco one. And you literally just walk around, these large conference centers tasting, right? I always joke whenever my friends are like, oh, I have to go to a work conference. It's going to be terrible. I'm like, why? You just eat and drink the whole time, right? They're wonderful. I recognize we have a very privileged work life in that regard. And so that's probably been the primary source through most of my history. The other thing is I'm a big nerd, so I'm always listening to social media or podcasts about cheese. And if I hear something enough that I have never tried, we're lucky enough that we can just email producers and be like, hey, can I get samples? And we get to try things. And so as we're always trying to stay ahead of the curve, we're always trying to find new sourcing. I was just telling Chelsea and Benji before we got on that I just started a new relationship with some New York operations. And so I'm going to be able to get products directly from New York, that it's a really special relationship, and we'll get even cooler new stuff that we haven't had before. So I spent most of my day adding about a dozen new olive oils and vinegars and cheeses and various things to the menu. So it's fun. It's a big part of our kind of culinary outfitting is to continue to find new things.
We have a couple comparisons by Brittany, wondering if you can confirm from your mind or what you've tasted. So Red Dragon is closer to a double Gloucester, isn't it? Or Cotswold with mustard instead of chives?
Yes, that is very correct. It is very close to a Cotswold or a double. And the reason why we don't use those words, at least Gloucester, if I'm correct, is coming from a specific region, right? And same with cheddar coming from Somerset. And this cheese just kind of, it doesn't fit into those things perfectly, but that is much closer to the texture that you're getting from this cheese. And I believe the fat content. Good call. Sounds like we have a British cheese expert, which I appreciate.
You were good to continue. Just a lot of people who love it on the Red Dragon.
Good. It is always one of the most popular cheeses. It's such a fun one, and it's great for this time of year. So we talk about these flavors of this time of year, right? And for me, with autumnal, there's a sweetness that starts coming out of things. I definitely think of mustard starting to come out, and smokiness, right? We talked about smoke with the Speck, and we're going to go with a little more smokiness with our Grafton Cheddar. You might notice always, whenever we have cheddars, I like to break them like this and get these organic shapes, because cheddar is such a beautiful cheese. It's not just the name of a cheese. It's also a geography. And beyond a geography, it's a verb. You cheddar a cheese. And so to cheddar something, it is back to the idea of curds and whey, right? We have our yogurt cup type idea of the curd in the center, and we're cutting that curd to get more and more moisture out our way. And when you get to a point where the curd can be cut to pieces about anywhere from an English pea to a grain of rice, something really small like that, you actually put the curds through a food mill, it pushes out all that tiny little pieces. I gather them together into a block, and I make these big rectangular bricks of cheese, and then I just start stacking them. And I take all the bricks and I stack, and it gets more draining that way. And why that's important is that's how the cheese fuses together and knits together. And so when I finally have a final cheese, I have these beautiful organic curds that kind of fuse together, and I can get fun crumbles that way. It also matters in the melt. Has anybody ever tried to melt like a really extra sharp cheddar and you found it kind of oily? It almost separates, right? This cheddar is a lot better for melting, but the reason you see that is because we've cut the protein so small, there's almost no room for it to hold the fat in this like emulsification that it once was. It all falls out of suspension. And so often you find that cheddars aren't the greatest thing to melt, and we want to use something like a mountain cheese to kind of fix the texture. But we've always loved this young cheddar because it kind of hits both notes, right? It melts really well, but it still has that sharpness. It's been on the Better Than Basic grilled cheese since day one. It's a maple smoked cheddar. Every once in a while, somebody thinks it's going to be sweet, and it's maple wood. There's no syrup involved in this cheese, and it's coming from the good folks over at Grafton. Grafton Village is a great cheese co-op in Vermont, and I always like to kind of pause when we talk about cheese co-ops because, you know, everybody talks so much about supporting small business, right? And we're so appreciative of that energy. But these cheese companies, they're beyond a small business. They're so often a constellation of many small businesses, right? When you're a cooperative dairy, it means many family farms are able to continue to, you know, milk their animals, produce dairy, and then just give it to a cheesemaker to do the next step. It continues to keep the landscape the way it is. It's a really important part of Vermont and Wisconsin's history are these cheese cooperatives. So we are really thankful for Grafton and all the work they do and the hundreds, if not thousands of family farms that they keep moving along.
Zach, quick question. Where does the smoke come from? So James and Julia asked, what does it mean smoked cheese? Do they put it in a smoker for a time? How does that process work from a cheese perspective?
It's a great question, right? And if we picture the backyard smokers, I would understand why anybody would be concerned or worried about that. And they do smoke it in a proper smoker, but it's a cold smoker. So it's much more akin to what you would do with like Nova style salmon or lox, right? If you were cold smoking fish, right? The idea of cold smoking is that you have two chambers. So I'm creating the fire in this chamber, but my products is in another chamber, and I'm going to pipe smoke into this chamber so it's not hot when it gets there. So this way the cheese isn't melting or cooking, right? And you do have times where people hot smoke cheeses. Often mozzarella, when it's smoked, will actually have a more hot smoke, and it happens very quickly. But this is a cold smoke, very gentle. Another cool thing about this cheese is it's a raw milk cheddar, right? You don't usually think of someone smoking a raw milk cheddar. And there's a history in cheddar of smoking batches that don't turn out well, which I always found bothersome, right? But these guys are making this with intention. They make a really nice cheddar that they, I think, show more respect to than a lot of other places. Great question. Any other questions so far, Benji?
No other questions, but you do have Jameson doing his best tasting notes. So Red Dragon and Salami and Speck and the maple smoked cheddar as well as it's a +2 in his mind for those that are familiar with the scale.
Beautiful. And guys, remember, not only is that a wonderful reference to the scale, it's also a complementary tasting, right? So we talk sometimes about contrasting flavors and complementary flavors. And if we're talking Speck and smoked cheddar, it's smoke on smoke. We're really bringing that forward. If Jameson's note was that he really liked, now I'm trying to think of a good contrasting one. You know, I actually found a contrasting one earlier. So the Kolsch with the pimento cheese, to me, has a little bit of the contrast because the Kolsch is light and effervescent, right? And the mayo has this density with the pimento has a density with that mayo. And so it actually ends up being almost like that high acid white wine thing that we do with triple creams. it gives you a little break to your palate. So it ends up being a little more contrasting. But I love the idea of smoke on smoke. Cool. Only one more cheese, guys, and then we're going to go through this really thoroughly with this tasting. I think it's really fun to kind of taste in tandem together. So the last cheese we have is Challerhocker. If people haven't had Hollerhacker on this tasting, I think you guys are in for a really special treat. Hollerhacker has a great story and it's a great cheese. The gentleman who makes this cheese is Walter Rass, and Walter finds himself growing up in Teufrichville, Switzerland. And Teufrichville is in Appenzeller country. And so I know for any of you guys who've been to our Alpine tasting or heard me talk mountain cheeses in general, I always like to remind people that the borders that we think in our mind of like, France and Switzerland, most often these borders as a modern day border are newer than these cheese traditions, right? These cheese traditions, this idea of making a mountain cheese, whether I was in Italy or in France or in Switzerland, had a lot of similarities. And so he grew up in a family that was making Appenzeller for 2-3 generations. The story of Swiss cheese, if anybody really likes podcasts, there's a fantastic Planet Money on the Swiss Cheese Consortium. And the idea of why fondue became so popular in the 60s and 70s. It all had to do with a big cheese surplus in Switzerland. So they describe this idea of the consortium as a body of government, essentially, that promoted the sales and culture of only a select few Swiss cheeses, right? They thought if they narrowed their focus, they'd be able to have a larger impact on the global cheese world. And so for most of us, we've all heard of the same Swiss cheeses over and over and over because there was actual government money behind making sure those were at the forefront. So that's ready. It's Gruyere, it's Emmentaler, which we so lovingly in America like to just call Swiss cheese, and that's the big holes. There's Appenzeller, and then there's Stilsitzer. There's plenty of other cheeses like Sprins and Etivas and I don't know, whatever. It doesn't matter. Hokie Brig. It's not that other cheeses weren't made. It's just they didn't get this kind of stamp of the consortium and they didn't get the money that came with that. And so why I bring all this up is Walter Rass, like I said, his grandfather made Appenzeller, his father makes Appenzeller, his brother makes Appenzeller. And as Walter was kind of going through his career, he became really well known for making exceptional cheese. So much so that it eventually, the consortium could taste Walter's cheese blind. They knew this wasn't just Appenzeller, it's Walter's Appenzeller because it's so great. But that's not really the point of a consortium-led cheese. Appenzeller should be Appenzeller should be Appenzeller. It's not about Walter, it's about Appenzeller. And so he started to get graded down, like a negative grading for his cheeses, which translate to less money for his cheeses because the quality was so exceptional that it was kind of muddying the waters, if you will. And that didn't work for him. So Walter around this time, met up with a gregarious and wild American cheese personality, Adam Moskowitz. And Adam convinced him that he could sell enough Hollerhacker in the US for Walter to just stop playing this rat race. And so after about 2-3 years of that relationship, Walter trusted Adam. He sold all of his Appenzeller shares to his brother, and Walter's been making just Hollerhacker ever since. It's an original recipe from the Ross family, and it's freaking great, I think. It has so much deliciousness and creaminess, and the reason why it maybe to you tastes a little more decadent than your average Gruyere is because he's not skimming any fat. Most of the time when you make an aged cheese like this, right? If I'm talking cheddar, if I'm talking mountain cheese, even Goudas, the idea of like rich milk, of course I want some richness, but really high fat is, it's volatile, right? It's like playing with fire. And so a lot of times you'll see people skim these kind of cheeses or just use leaner milk because of the breed that they're dealing with or so on and so forth. And Walter's not doing that. He's taking the milk of his cows, unadulterated, and making cheese with it. And so it has a higher fat content. If you were to calculate the fat content of this, it would be much similar to like a triple cream like we do with Breeze. We just don't really talk about firm cheeses in that same way.
You have couple people, Megan mentions that there's a little stank on the cheese, so you can
Totally.
just do it.
Yeah. So it's a wash rind cheese, right? Which is another term we only associate with soft cheeses. But what Walter's doing as the cheese ages is he's rubbing it with a little bit of salt water. And what that does to the little stank comment, it totally does. It brings out this like, a little bit of basement, a little bit of funk. And I think it just kind of gives it a meatiness. To me, this cheese has always had like a bone broth kind of note to it that I just can't get enough of. But you're right, it definitely it tingles the nose a little bit.
Britt says this is her favorite cheese, and then Dave asks, "Are there any Italian cheeses younger than the country of Italy?"
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that what we often miss in all of our fascination with the European traditional cheeses is just like Freigeist opened in 2009 to celebrate these lost beers. There are people who are, I guess, inspired anew and are still creating new products in these countries. We just still focus on Parmesan and Pecorino and the things that kind of get the most airwaves. But when I was in Italy in October, I had a cheese that was insane. It was one of the top 5 cheeses of my life. No joke. And when I was asking them about what kind of cheese it would be, they just kept saying the name over. Signor G, Signor G. And I believe his name was Giovanni. It was just like named after the guy who made it. Actually, the guy's grandfather. And it's like a little pudgy, washed rind sheep smoked cheese from Tuscany. It follows no classification. It's just Signor G. And, it's raw milk. It's totally an illegal cheese in America. And it was so freaking good. Signor G. So that cheese is younger than Italy for sure. It's probably only 30, 40 years old. If anybody ever comes across it, smuggle it back. All right. Are we ready to start talking pairings?
Good to go.
Good to go. Awesome. All right. So now we have this kind of all the tools at our disposal, right? We've tasted everything on their own, and we can start mixing and matching. And I love that Jameson already got a couple suggestions out to you folks. And I want you to go ahead and let's start with the meat. And we're going to taste something, whichever meat you prefer. I'm going to taste the Speck. And I'm going to taste the Speck and then drink a beer, taste the Speck, drink a beer, taste the Speck and drink a beer. And I'm going to guess that when you do this, each one's going to have a different effect. So I'm going to be quiet for a second while you all do this. And once we do this with the meat, I want us to do it with the cheese next. So start with your Kolsch. And I want you to be paying attention to what are you tasting and which product is changing, right? I don't talk about this enough, but when we talk about pairings, it's very rare that both products win, right? Those positive twos that both things are enhanced, they're rare. It's often a give and take, right? I like to say that one product usually has to lead. So when I'm picking products, I want the cheese to taste the best it possibly can. But if you were at the brewery, they'd be picking products that highlight the beer more. So as you're tasting through, if you can tell which thing is changing more, I'd love to hear it. Okay, one more, and then I'm going to start giving you guys some conclusions. But go ahead and throw it in the chat if you guys have noticed anything profound yet. It's kind of fascinating. So for me, and please, like I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts. As I try this Speck, which is a delicious pig, with everything, they all have a different effect. So when I try it with the Kolsch, I mentioned earlier the Kolsch is really mild, very effervescent. It has a really kind of a smooth and mild taste. And when it gets all that salt from the pig next to it, it kind of shows off how sweet it is, right? It really tastes like sweet grain to me. It pulls out almost, I'd say like apricot notes or almost like light stone fruit notes. And it's not quite as fruity as like a white wine or something like that, but it definitely pulls out the sweetness of the whole experience. And to me, the beer changes. The pig stands alone. It's unchanged by the beer in some ways. Now, when I try it with the Dortmunder, and there's a little, you can see I just toasted the grain a little bit more. I've probably added a little bit more hops, and it's more than just toasting, but there's not a whole huge change from that, right? And when I try it with that, with the Dortmunder, to me, it pulls out not so much this like sweet fruit note, but I start getting a nuttiness to it, right? The extra bit of color, maybe, I start thinking of toasted oats, toasted nuts, not so much a sweet grain, but a little bit darker things. When I get all the way to the Vienna Lager, I actually think this starts to be a discussion of intensity, right? The Vienna Lager with that little bit of hop background, it starts to actually compete with the Speck a little bit. And I don't know that it necessarily comes through the same way. I get more change off of these two beers than I do from this. This doesn't change it as profoundly to me. And it's really interesting how sometimes it does these things that you don't expect where, you know, even as we kind of ramp up the flavor, I eventually almost shut off and get a diminishing return from that exchange. So let's do this same project, and let's do it with Hollerhacker, right? Hollerhacker has so much flavor. I think we're going to see how it changes a lot. And if anybody, I already mentioned the Kolsch and the Pimento being a really fun one. All right, Hollerhacker. So taking a wedge of our cheese, hollering for Hollerhacker. If anybody's ever seen the label of this cheese or is close enough to Google something, if you Google Hollerhacker and you see the Hollerhacker kid, it's one of the creepiest kid and creepiest cheese labels that we have in our arsenal, but I always love it. And it's the legend goes that in Swiss culture, the youngest kid isn't capable of any of the farm chores, right? They're just going to mess things up. So what you assign them to do is to watch the cheese in the cellar watcher. And that's what Hollerhacker is. And so Walter's neighbor did an artist depiction of what he thought a Hollerhacker looked like. And the world was forever changed. All right, so Hollerhacker and beer. And actually, I forget who mentioned it, but let's really pay attention to that steak, right? What happens to that like meaty funkiness as we introduce it to things? So I think that's where we're going to find the most profound changes. Okay. Kolsch, that is interesting. To me, the Kolsch really brought out the funk of the cheese and how like tangy it almost was. That was weird. Okay. Dortmunder's starting to be leveling the playing field. I'm getting a lot of that. You know, the cheese has a nuttiness. We always talk about that in Gruyere, but I think that steak kind of overwhelms the nuttiness usually when you're eating it on its own. So you start focusing on the meaty notes. The Dortmunder kind of neutralizes that. So all of a sudden the nut comes out a little bit more. And now with the Vienna Lager, that's really cool. So for me, and once again, I would love to hear your notes. I get that effect of the nuttiness that I just mentioned, but something about that Vienna Lager kind of lets the full expression of the Hollerhacker back out. So I get so much cool flavors. I would imagine that if you made a little Hollerhacker with your Nostrano, drank it down with a little Vienna Lager, you might be in a really nice place. Let's talk about all these different pairings. I thought Jameson earlier mentioned the +2, and I know we have a lot of people who've been through these tastings a lot with us, but I always like to run through this whole pairing scale, right? The whole idea of the scale is that what we're doing is so much more dynamic than just saying, I like this beer, 1 through 10, I give it a 9. When we start adding different flavors, right, there's just a whole other conversation happening. So I've been using a scale that the late, great Daphne Zeppos taught me many, many years ago. And Daphne laid out a -2 to +3. So -2 is going to be, we've all experienced a -2. You've done this before. You brush your teeth, you go have a glass of orange juice, everything's wrong, right? The flavors are just not complementary. They're contrasting, but they're contrasting on every single level. right? I all of a sudden don't have any tropical sweetness. I don't have any minty fresh. I just have a bad start to a day. And that's a -2. A -1 happens when you're drinking something and it ruins, or I'm sorry, you're drinking something, you eat something and it ruins your drink. I find this happens the most with red wine. You go back to your red wine and it tastes metallic. I've never had that happen with beer. Like I said, beer tends to be a little more forgiving. And please, in the chats, has anybody had a -1 with a beer where you tasted the beer and it just ruined something? Maybe sometimes with sours this can happen because the sour is such a profound flavor where it could ruin one thing or another. But I find with beer, you get much less on the negative spectrum. Zeros. Now, zeros, I've said this before, but I think zeros are the most common thing we have, right? And it's not because the food isn't great or someone did something wrong, but I think that it's a level of mindfulness, right? How often do we sit and eat and drink and then dissect what's happening on our palates? It's not usually the norm. Usually we're eating, drinking, and doing a million things at the same time. Hell, half the time we're eating and drinking while driving 60 miles per hour. It's very hard to come up with tasting notes when you're driving and eating your sandwich. And so I think that it requires a slowing down, and then it still requires that flavors interact, right? When we tried all 3 beers with the Speck, I don't think they all had an interaction. I really do think by the time we got to the Vienna Lager and the Speck, it was just a 0. They just kind of existed. But when we got to the Kolsch, I like how they played. And so that's the idea of zeros. A +1, right, to change it to a beer scenario. If I'm cooking a pot of chili and my chili just doesn't have, it's missing something, and I pour a little stout in that chili and it gives it a great depth. Oh, now the chili's perfect. Great, +1, because the stout didn't get any better for being dumped into my chili. The chili got better though. So only one thing wins, +1. +2, Jameson mentioned earlier, maybe when you try the Speck on its own, you find it to just be whatever. It's salty, delicious meat. And when you tried the cheddar, maybe you thought it was younger than it was sharp and it wasn't that interesting. But when we put the Speck together and the cheddar, all of a sudden they start rounding each other out. A little bit of extra creaminess from the cheddar adds a subtlety to the Speck that you really like, and you start to taste maybe the peppercorns or the bay or the juniper, and that light herbaceousness kind of adds something, and you really notice the smoky notes of the cheddar and how subtle they are. In general, I think one of the biggest notes or takeaways that I get from this lineup is subtlety, right? In American cuisine, we're kind of known for bigger flavors, right? If you think of our beer, barrel-aged stouts, big IPAs, incredibly puckering sours. And I think that at least in German and English beer, so much of their history is about subtlety, dialing it a little bit this way, a little bit of that way. And same with Speck, right? Or the cheddar for that matter, even though it's from the States, it's not like bacon smoky, right? I love Benton's bacon. Has anybody ever had Benton's bacon? Really wonderful company out of Tennessee. And his bacon is so smoky that it's you can never miss it, right? You could taste it blind every single day, and it's nothing wrong with it. It makes sense for that space. But I think so often when we hear smoke, we think that level of bacon, or we think of barbecue. And I think that these guys are showing you that you can use it just as a little ingredient. It's so much more European, this approach. But I got carried away. We are still on +2s. So +3s, the peanut butter and jelly effect, right? They're super rare, but this idea that we've created flavors that the sum are greater than the parts, and this is how we should eat them forever, right? And I think that beer has them, and we don't talk about them the way that wine does, right? We always talk about the same wine pairings over and over, port and Stilton. In beer, I think there's a lot of things that are kind of a +3 in the beer world. Just people don't talk about beer the same way. But I think that a lot of those salty meats, a hot dog and a beer, right? There's not a whole lot better than that. And I think you get a little bit of that with your salami and beer kind of thing. Add a little bit of mustard in that with the Red Dragon, and you're really starting to get to a place where, you're hitting so many different notes that I think you're creating some wonderful flavor combinations. I'm going to take a pause and do that myself. What questions do we have, Benji?
No questions right now, but Dave does say PBR in the next morning, a solid -1.
I like that. So what beers have people been enjoying the most? I'm curious, and I also want to know if people find that there's a beer that they enjoy the most versus a beer that pairs the most or has the most interaction with other products. What about you, Jameson? What are you thinking? I know we talked earlier, you were talking about bringing in some extra beers for this. Did you end up bringing in a Marzen?
We've gotten a Kolsch and Red Dragon vote. Freigeist. James, Vienna Lager, 100%. Julia was the Kolsch. So a
Cool.
lot of variety out there for sure.
Good. Has anybody tried this pairing I just suggested? Red Dragon and your salami. It gives you a little of that ballpark vibe. And I really liked it with the Dortmunder.
Got a 10 out of 10 on that one. Megan likes the Dortmunder the least overall on its own.
Cool. I mentioned, or I didn't mention this earlier, but the Vienna Lager is from Old Nation, right? Back to this kind of juxtaposition between American brewing styles and European brewing styles. Old Nation's probably most famously known for their M43, right? M43 is a New England IPA, and it literally saved that brewery. And I mean, that is a punch in your face. It's this tropical milkshake type of an experience. And I love when you see these brewers that do that, dust off an old classic recipe and show you that they can do it with restraint. So coming out of Williamston, Michigan, and it's just a fantastic beer, the Vienna Lager, I think. All right. So now I know none of us are going to have any cheese left over at the end of the day, but if you were to cook with things, I think you have a bunch of really fun things to cook with here. And you could totally just do a mac and cheese with these 3 firm cheeses and be in a really good space. But I want to talk a little bit about ways to cook with these things. Red Dragon, when you heat it, is going to intensify that mustard. So I really like it, I mentioned, in a mac and cheese. But if you make it on a cheeseburger, it ends up being a lot of mustard. Some people love that. To me, it goes a little too much. So I like blending Red Dragon a little bit, but I when I heat it. Now the smoked cheddar I mentioned, sometimes smoked cheddar can be oily. This smoked cheddar melts really well. So you could do a smoked cheddar all on its own, great in a burger, anything like that. But whenever I'm making mac and cheese and I'm actually like thinking of a recipe and not just throwing all my ends into a pot, I like to do, 2 parts texture, 1 part flavor. And what I mean by that is if I was, for instance, doing the Red Dragon, if I use 1 part Red Dragon, I want to use double that same weight of something like the Hollerhacker. Hollerhacker, these mountain cheeses that have been cooked and pressed, are made for fondue. They're engineered to melt perfectly, right? And so I want something that's going to give us this velvety texture, and then I want to spice it up with the mustard, right? Now, Hollerhacker is a big cheese, so if you chose to do that 2 in 1, it's going to have a really assertive mac and cheese. But the same principle would apply if I use something like Holy Cow or Toma, which is a little milder, and that's going to fix my texture. And that's the same idea if I want to use like our 8-year cheddar. 8-year cheddar has so much flavor, or Lemieux's Gouda, one of our most common cheeses. There's so much flavor in those cheeses, but if I tried to make a pot of just that, it's never going to get that cheese consistency I want. No cheese pulls. And so if I blend it with a little raclette, a little Holy Cow, a little Hollerhacker, you start to get to the right textures. Pimento cheese you can cook with, but it gets real soupy real fast. So if you put it on a cheeseburger, just be forewarned, it's going to be pimento cheese down the arms. And same with a grilled cheese. I do it every once in a while, but you just got to know it's going to be messy. They're fun.
We did have Jameson who said, thinking the Red Dragon on a coney. Is that a crazy thought?
Ooh, that's a great idea. I think that's a really cool idea, and I want to try it.
Also had Dave a little bummed you guys didn't include a Honeycrisp Apple in the box.
It is that time of year, and so much of these flavors to me are all about what to eat with apples. In the many ways that I am a nerd, I am totally an apple nerd and really like esoteric apple varieties. And we did a pairing series, might have been last week, with Shorts and Pure Michigan and the Michigan Brewers Guild, where we talked about autumnal flavors and Shorts Pure Michigan IPA. And I paired it with the pimento cheese, and I paired everything with apples because whether it's a cider mill or eating something off the tree, it's that time of year. It's apple season.
We have
If anybody has a favorite apple variety, go ahead and text in the chat. Mine's an Arkansas Black.
We do have Beth with the pretzel, pimento, and Speck. Surprisingly good combination there.
Yeah, I love these three-tier pairings. Thank you guys for mashing it up.
And then Dave will do pimento and grits as well.
Oh, that's a cool idea. Dave, when do you put in the pimento? Is it when you have all the water cooked out of your grits and you have kind of the finished product? So about the time you would add butter, or is it go in earlier?
He is typing that out right now. Jameson
Cool.
said he's been filtering all the beer through the Speck. Is that not right?
I like that.
Yep. And Dave says, yep, when you would add mascarpone or butter is when you would add the pimento.
Oh, wow. That sounds so good. I think I know what I'm doing this weekend. That sounds like a plan. Beautiful. All right. Let's take a quick little break and talk about chocolate, friends. And of course, please keep asking questions. And maybe we're going to see if the chocolate has a place with any of our cheeses tonight. We're going to Suffolk to Pump Street Chocolate. Pump Street's a wonderful brand. And I love that they started as bakers, right? They started making bread. They learned this idea of craftsmanship. And I know we probably don't all make this jump from chocolate to bread or bread to chocolate and thinking that there's, a correlation. But I really think that anytime you as a producer understand that like ingredients change day by day and you have to react to it, I think you have the right kind of person, right? On our last tasting, Sam from Zingerman's was on, and he was talking about how the milk is not the same ingredient day to day, right? The animals eat different things. It's a different animal in the mix, so on and so forth. Fat, protein, that all fluctuates. And from year to year, chocolate is going to change quite a bit from harvest to harvest. And the reason why I always focus on their bread making, I spent a semester at college being a baker, and I thought it was fascinating. On a very humid, hot day, you put less water in the bread, right? Maybe even throw ice cubes in the bread to keep it cooler in the pot or in the mixing bowl, because the heat will start proofing the bread in the mixer. You adjust the recipe based on all these different factors in the air. And I think that that's just the most beautiful idea. And so Pump Street clearly understands the subtleties of working with natural products, and they've done a great job, and they started putting their bread in their products from day one. And so I bet a handful of you guys have had their Rye Bar before, which is a dark milk from Ecuador, 60% with rye crumb. I have probably one of my favorite dark chocolates. I got the Jamaica, and I bet there's a couple different ones that people got. 85 Ecuador, maybe some sourdough bars, which is also Ecuadorian chocolate. But either way, I digress. I think that these guys are doing an amazing job. It's a father and his daughter that started the company. And for the 75, I get this beautiful, like right down the middle, right? I like to talk about flavor wheels. And sometimes we talk about all those bright fruit notes. And sometimes we talk about all these deep, spicy, earthy notes. And I think these guys are just right down the middle. They kind of hit both, but they don't go too far in one direction. And then real quick, let's talk about evaluating a chocolate bar, because I don't think we do that enough. You'll see it has this little like shine, right? Hopefully it picks up that with the light. You want that. That means it's a properly tempered chocolate. And then the other thing is we want to hear that snap when I open it. So snap and shine are the things we're looking for being well tempered. And a chocolate that falls out of temper is this idea that the protein, the sugars, the fats, and all these different things, they're in a great matrix of deliciousness. And at some point, something falls out of suspension and it's usually the sugar or the fat that gets kind of pushed out to the edge. And you see this bar that's dusty looking almost. Chocolate that's been out of temper is totally still good. It's never going to make you sick. And you can actually re-temper chocolate. And so if you're going to bake with it and make chocolate chip cookies, or if you're dipping strawberries with chocolate, if you have a bunch of chocolates out of temper, you throw it in your double boiler or in your chocolate selmy. And what you do is you actually put a piece of chocolate that's proper and you throw it in the mix, and it's called tempering from seed. All of a sudden, once the pot of chocolate gets a little seed of chocolate all being in this right suspension, the whole pot will fall into suspension. It's a little chocolate miracle. And so if you guys ever get a bar and it's, bloomed, you should save it for the next time you're actually going to bake with chocolate and see if you can pull it back out of the depths. What questions do we have about chocolate? I want to tell you a little. I mean, you guys mostly at this group know the story about Mongers and our chocolate, but while you guys think about your questions, I'll tell you about our focus at chocolate. Mongers from day one has been really into chocolate, and Will, our chief chocolate officer, has done a fantastic job of building the state's largest selection of bean to bar chocolate or craft chocolate. So we really like companies like Pump Street who are doing direct trade whenever they can. And when you read their labels, you see that level of care, right? Because for this, we're talking about Bachelor Hall Estate. It's not just chocolate from Jamaica. It's chocolate from this spot in Jamaica, just like we would talk about wine, or even when you get really into some of the more esoteric beers where they're telling you where their malt was grown or what variety of hops. Why is it the chocolate for so long has just been kind of ignored and not given this level of specificity and care? We found that the story of chocolate, the history of chocolate, is so often one of colonialism and one of ignoring half the story, right? I think so many people on this call maybe love Swiss chocolate or German chocolate or Belgian chocolate, hell, even Hershey's chocolate, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, at least in theory, but the idea that none of those places actually grow chocolate is important. And so we really want chocolate to come from places that it's grown, or at least to be celebrated those who grew the chocolate. So you can buy chocolate in Suffolk, but somebody needs to tell you where they got the chocolate from. It's important, right? Because otherwise we assume it's coming from West Africa, where somewhere like 85% of the world's chocolate comes from. And they have all sorts of child labor issues and slave labor issues. So we really want direct trade. And it's been a really fun time for us to explore this world of chocolate and some of the moral realities behind chocolate. And I think it actually tastes better with that bit of context that we get as well.
Perfect. We've had people loving the chocolate and Hollerhacker combination. Multiple people have stated how great that is.
Yeah, Benji, go ahead.
I was just gonna say we also had a question about can we order these products from you? They've loved everything, so most of these I know are available on mongersprovisions.com.
They are. Most of these products are available. The one that is not is this was a special treat for this tasting, Pop Daddy. But if you think we should start carrying it, let us know. I think it's cool. I actually, back to the question of how we discover these, the first time I tried Pop Daddy was not in Michigan, even though it's a Michigan product. It was at the Snacks and Sweets show in Chicago, which is the most decadent of the shows to be at. Hollerhacker and chocolate, I'm trying it. So the reason I think that goes well is because of that nuttiness, right? It almost is like a salty peanut butter and chocolate thing going on. That's super fun. Whoever thought of that, thank you.
We do have at least one vote for to start carrying that Pop Daddy. So
oh, cool, good.
Does seem to be some fans. Then we did get a question. What was the interview for Chief Chocolate Officer like? How detailed was it? How many people were interviewed? Obviously, Will being a co-owner didn't really have to interview in the same way, but
not a lot of competition for that. I actually really like the mustard with the chocolate. I have a fascination of Red Dragon with chocolates. To me, it does similar things as anybody had a mostarda, right? It's a unique kind of preservation method. It's an Italian food where you take mustard oil and mustard seeds and fruit and preserve it together. So there's the sweet and savory kind of interplay with them. And if you ever have a raspberry chocolate with a mustard cheese, it's totally chocolate mostarda. It's the weirdest thing ever. But whenever I have Red Dragon and chocolate together, I always mash them up. I think it's fun.
Another vote for Pop Daddy, and also a lot of people just loving the Red Dragon altogether, which is not a surprise.
Not a surprise. It's always the most popular cheese. When we were in the glass houses last year, and so many people got to meet us for the first time, if anybody remembers last winter, the kind of Christmas village downtown, Red Dragon was nearly impossible to keep on the shelves. It was it's a good winter warmer, good for autumn, and all around just a fun cheese. I know we didn't really have a full football season, but it's a good football cheese too. That's accurate, right, Benji? I know I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to sports.
It is accurate. College football down the same way NFL is trying to do the full season. So so
Okay.
far you're decent.
I'm decent. Halfway right. And that's really what I aim at. So
Yes. We do have a comment. Speaking of holiday cheeses, you might as well go into the whole holiday cheese spiel this is about. Is Black Betty going to be back this year?
absolutely. So thank you, Benji, for giving me the license to go through the whole spiel. Black Betty is definitely coming in. And I've been working on a blog that will tell you about all the things coming and when they're coming in. So you'll probably see that early next week. But we're going to be getting Rush Creek Reserve from our friends over at Uplands Dairy, the people who make Pleasant Ridge Reserve, making their kind of similar to a Harbison, another soft cheese with a wood wrap. We'll be getting the Black Betty. We already have Rogue River Blue in, if anybody remembers that from years past. Rogue River Blue actually won a huge award last year, and so it was really exciting. It was the first American cheese to ever win the World Cheese Expo in Bergamo, Italy. And so Rogue River, best in show, not just best in category of this entire competition. And overnight, David Gremmels became an international cheese superstar. And we got more of it in this last year, because last year when that happened, I had 5 wheels in my hands. I was so excited when I saw the news. And then I feel like 2 weeks later, we had 0 cheese. So we got more this year, and they make that cheese only once a year, which is why you can only get what you can get. It's a blue cheese wrapped in a Syrah grape leaf that's been macerated in pear brandy. So you get all this flavor. They make it during the spring equinox and then release it during the autumn. I don't know. They're very into the weather and the
Summer
equinoxes.
solstice.
Summer solstice. Thank you. I knew there was another word. I kept just coming back to equinox. Solstice. Thank you. Fabulous cheese. And then the other stuff we're going to be getting for the holidays is Comté Sagesse, the Wisdom Comté, a little older than we usually get. And that might be it of the pre-stuff. We'll be getting a different Iberico like we did last year, and some different fun stuff. I know Will has some fun chocolates, and we got a whole mess of new olive oils and stuff like that. So a lot more of the pantry stuff than we've done in the past as we've grown that selection, and some fun sauces and stuff.
Will did mention he has a comment on the pretzels. Will, I don't know if you do want to sneak in with that comment.
Yeah, so I brought this up in a couple of our other tastings, and we did a few Oktoberfest tastings that were private, and then we did this public one, and we wanted to do, great snackable food, right? Beer and pretzels and stuff like that. We work with 6, 7, 8 different distributors. We have thousands of products combined on the list that we can get from. And Zach and I were looking for pretzels, and we thought with 7 distributors and it would be easy, and we couldn't find a single just plain salted pretzel out of all of these lists of distributors. So we ended up with this delicious Pop Daddy, buttermilk black peppercorn pretzel. But I find that fascinating that there's just this partition amongst food distributors. Like the distributors that would deal with pretzels that are simple snacking food are grocery store distributors, and we deal with distributors that primarily cater to restaurants and specialty food stores like ourselves. And so it was really interesting. Like, we didn't think it would be a problem. We kind of set the menu for the tasting and thought about the cheeses and the beers. And we were like, well, the pretzels we'll figure it out. Somebody's got to have pretzels. And we went through every single list, and we couldn't find a salted pretzel stick or twist or anything other than a soft pretzel sort of designed for food service on any of the lists other than Pop Daddy Pretzels, which happened to be a Michigan-made product, so we felt good about bringing it in for the event. But I just thought it was fascinating to see how different the distribution channels are when you're dealing with specialty products versus grocery products. And that goes from cheeses, and olive oils to things like pretzels and potato chips and stuff like that. So
Yeah, even our, I'm sure you remember this, Will, but mayo, right? Like we use mayo for our grilled cheeses. It's one of our signature things. We think it gives you a much better crust and more deliciousness. And you can only find like the really fancy mayo or veganese or things like that on our list. There isn't kind of this everyday food service element. Will's definitely right. There is more complexity than you guys would ever want to know when it comes to ordering all these different wonderful products.
and that that kind of explains part of why grocery stores didn't have chickens in April and May, and we were able to carry chickens because, our primary sources of distribution are people who cater to restaurants. The restaurants were all shut down, so they had plenty of supply of these things, while the grocery store distribution channels had none of it. There was this run on grocery stores, and it's like it's just two completely different networks, and it's crazy how the food industry, works in the United States on that end. And then real quick, a note on other holiday items. Zach, I believe we did get in a Pio Ticini ham today, right? So on
The
top
prosciutto
of,
we've wanted since day one.
yeah, it's really like one of the it's one of the holy grails of prosciutto. Do you know what are we talking? Do you know what age profile it is?
I believe it's at least 12 months. That is the classic, is that it has to be a whole year.
Yeah.
I don't know off the top of my head if it's older or not. But yeah, Pio Ticini is incredible stuff. It's what we used to sell at Byright.
Great producer, very storied producer. They make an exceptional product, and so that's a holiday edition, and as well as the other cheeses we were mentioning. And then we got in some new pastas today that are great. Several products. We brought in a new distributor recently, and so we've got a really great lineup from them. There's a new Mahone in the store, I believe. So it's pretty exciting there with the new access that this has opened up to us.
And I guess since Will brought up this idea of kind of, and even the first question that came up about how we find these products, this truck that Will mentioned is a project I've been working on for 18 months. So after 18 months of asking for this pipeline and trying to get these products, we finally got them. And I knew I wanted Pio Ticini prosciutto when we opened the store at Farm Field Table. But we just couldn't get it, right? We couldn't get it in a reasonable fashion. And so sometimes these are like, you meet a product or you find a new producer and it's as easy as calling them and saying ship it. And sometimes it's about really you have to find the route or it's just impossible to get, especially when we're talking about imported products. So we're so thankful that you guys continue to encourage us and ask for things. A lot of our products are guest requests that we then hunt down. But it's a really fun way for us to kind of continue to be your culinary guides. And we just love this tour of the world that we get to do trying to find these products.
New question that just came in, Zach. Jacob likes cheeses that pair with honey or marmalade. Which of these three would go best with one?
So I really like honey or even marmalade with bolder flavors, right? If we're talking about a ricotta, it can be really nice, but it almost is just like eating honey and fat at that point. So what I end up doing with honey is I tend towards sheep smoked cheeses, blue cheeses. This smoked cheese I think would be really nice with the honey. They just add a little bit of that sweetness and give you some contrast. For the marmalade, that's an interesting question. I wonder if the marmalade would go well with the Hollerhacker. Back to that same nutty note that we talked about, maybe we could pull out the nuttiness with the marmalade and get a little bit of that kind of jam and peanut butter vibes going. I think that would be the way I would try it. Cool question.
We had Dave who mentioned they were pairing the Speck with a honey with spruce in it, which was awesome.
Oh, that is cool. I like that. And I bet the spruce pulls out some of those notes in the Speck of that herbaceousness that we were talking about with the juniper and the rosemary. That's a very cool idea. When I'm really at a loss and trying to figure out these pairings, or if anybody could see what's happening in my brain as I write these menus, I actually I aim at secondary flavors. This is going to be a hard thing to say. I've never actually tried to explain this too much, but like you mentioned the spruce and the honey, right? If you only aim at the sweetness of the honey and you try to only focus on that, yeah, there's a lot of obvious answers, but there's also a lot of opportunity for contrast because that's the boldest flavor. But if you don't aim at the primary flavor and you aim at the spruce, you can have a whole lot of fun and most likely never contrast or like clash something because it's not as prominent, right? And so trying to pay attention to the little subtle notes and the hints of things when you're trying to pick out the next product to tease that hint out is often a safer bet than going with the most obvious flavor and embellishing on that or contrasting that obvious flavor. Does that make any sense at all, Benji?
It seemed like it made sense, so I'll go with it. It was good.
It works in my brain, and hopefully you guys all think it works in your palates because, you guys keep showing up. So thank you. And I'll keep making pairings.
We also had a Nutella and Hollerhacker shout out there by Dave as well.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I love all these like nutty, peanutty things that we're adding to Hollerhacker. The Nutella is totally trying to remember a perfect bite that I once evaluated at the Cheesemonger Invitational. Definitely had that Hollerhacker and kind of, it might have been Nutella actually. It's Hollerhacker and a peanut flavor for sure. It was really special.
Perfect. No other questions.
No other questions.
Currently, I don't know if you.
Awesome.
I don't know if you want to kind of talk about what might be upcoming. I know we talked about the holidays and all that stuff, but potential events and other things that might be happening around Mongertown. Additionally, besides products.
Well, this is really our time of year, right? We love the holidays, right? It's always funny for a Jewish boy who, celebrate Christmas is so joyfully as I do, but this is such a food time of year and there's so many different products that the whole season is built around Christmas and coming out and premiering. So for us, this time of year, we're going to be focusing on bringing you new things, right? Because of all the craziness that everybody's been having with Corona and supply chains. I think a lot of our really loyal friends who come and visit us week after week have been seeing the same cheeses, right? There hasn't been a lot of new stuff and you're going to see that floodgate really come in. So over a dozen new products showed up today and by tomorrow they'll be added to the system. I'm working on it. And then you'll see the ones that we kind of pre-programmed and talked about already. And then in terms of events and things that are going on, we've been kicking around since the last tasting. Someone brought up a New Year's tasting. So maybe doing a New Year's Eve event, probably at like 7 or 8 o'clock. So you can still do whatever you want with the ball dropping and whatnot, but an earlier New Year's Eve thing. We're also looking into having some kind of classes that don't have a time sensitivity. So it's a little bit more pre-recorded idea and some of those tasting boxes coming out, hopefully. Grilled cheeses are back up and going if anybody hasn't been to the store lately, and that's really fun. Both stores are open right now. So the Rust Belt Market's open on the weekends. No grilled cheeses or alcohol at that location, at least not from us. They have a great bar you can go visit. And then Detroit's open 7 days a week. And like I said, grilled cheeses are back in full force. And, holiday wine we're also bringing in. So we're definitely switching up some of those like really perfect summer sippers to different flavors that kind of work with all the cooking we're going to be doing for the holiday and all those beautiful autumnal flavors. So we'll be celebrating Beaujolais Nouveau. We'll be bringing in some I'm trying to think of it. Oh, we brought in a beautiful dry Riesling that we played with at our last tasting. Many of you probably tried. And I have a cooking Madeira. It was a choice. I'm curious if other people like it as much, but I like cooking with Madeira, and I especially like these mushroom and bean casseroles. I just picture it this time of year. So we played with that as well.
We got a couple of recommendations for future pairings come January. A wassail tasting with cider and English cheeses, or a duck and cover, duck charcuterie and wrapped rind cheeses.
That's a fun one. Duck and cover. I like that. It's a cheesemonger right there talking. And we are talking, we mentioned it a little bit ago, but in January, we're going to go ahead and do the blues tasting, a deep dive into blue cheeses. And we're also going to do Love Stinks in February. So we are definitely going to keep doing these deep dives into different cheese subjects. If anybody has been feeling the lack of Roquefort at the store, probably for almost a year now, because we haven't been able to get it. I just got a new Roquefort in this New York truck too. So the famous sheep's milk blue will be at the store soon, or is at the store now, and be available soon. Yeah, a lot of new stuff coming down the pipe. It's an exciting time.
Looks like that's it on questions, Zach.
Awesome. Well, friends, I just want to keep saying we really appreciate all the support we get from you. We hope you had fun tonight with this smorgasbord of snack food, and we're just so thankful that we have all of you guys in our lives. We love feeding you guys. We love connecting with you. And as long as you keep showing up, we're going to keep coming up with unique ways to gather together, break bread together, and talk food. So thank you guys from the bottom of our hearts. The whole Monger team really appreciates all the support we get from you guys, and I hope you enjoyed your evening.
Hey, Zach, it was really, really fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much.